Look, you saw the title. You know me as a person. You know how cringe this could get. So instead of having an ooh fest of an intro, how about we calm down, take a step back, and make a truce, okay? I won't be cringe this entire episode if you promise not to be a dick. Okay. Sounds good? Alright, so let's hop into the yiff pile and ooh our way into the furry community, right, guys? Oh, come on. No, please. Look, I get one free one, right? It's just the intro. I get a free one, right? Come on. I see you disliking and leaving hate comments already. Come on, man, please. Alright, well, if you're gonna do it anyways, I guess we'll just talk about furries today. On Why Aren't You Talking About This? Nerd. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Waytat Nerd. I am your host, William, and I will be your host today through the insert sexual innuendo here, World of Furries today. I don't even need to. You animals will do it yourself. But before we get too deep into that, I want to thank you so much for listening to the show. For real, it means the world to me. Things are pretty fucking scary, so it genuinely means a lot to have people listen in on my ramblings. Nothing really too silly this time on the front end. Um, yeah, as far as like updates and shoutouts go, same updates. Make sure to support Win Kashika and Mystic Luna. And again, yeah, things are pretty fucked right now. So thank you for supporting them in any way that you can, and for supporting me in any way that you can, and just make sure to keep sharing stuff around and uh, trying to trying to fight for some of the values that we talk about in the show. Hopefully there's some turnaround soon and things can get kind of back to normal, especially on the show. But yeah, things fucking suck. So let's just distract ourselves for a little bit and talk about something that's not absolutely awful. Okay, shake it off. So furries, what are they? Well, besides cringe, they're someone who has an interest in anthropomorphic animal-like characters. Now, usually what people think of when they think of furries is someone with a deeper interest than just like. I don't mean like nerd as in I read comic books sometimes and watch Dragon Ball Z. I mean nerd as in I read Batman novelizations and watch D. Gray Man. Not too deep, but way deeper than the first one. Also, despite the name, furry can cover a wide range of interests, despite the name being a play on fur. Scales, feather, skin to some extent. But of course, because we're talking about something that closet furries that hate furries think is just about porn, there's an elephant in the room that we need to address, and no, not your fursona. Also, yes, if you've ever shot rope to Judy Hopson, you're a fucking furry. But there's a few kinds of furries that don't really have subcultural names, but still exist. First is the kind that are just fans and like furry and anthro characters in general. They just think they're neat. The second type are the lifestyle furries, being people that have or want fursuits, participate actively in the fandom, and encapsulate many aspects of their lives into being a furry. And the third major type are the ones where it's primarily about sex and the fetish of being a furry. Now, these people are not zoophiles, but they're into anthro characters sexually. And now, also, these are very reductionary and don't fully encapsulate the fandom. Because the thing is that since furries are people, shock to some of you, I know, these are just a few ways the fandom can be expressed, and in reality, most people in the fandom are some combination of the three. But also, since the furry fandom has a reputation for being very accepting of people, it's also a welcome place for both queer people who aren't furries and take on the furry label to have a safe space, and for other fandoms and belief systems that wouldn't normally be accepted by others. But also, before we really get into terminology, we should ask ourselves, where does this come from? Like, why do people become furries? Well, we don't actually have a clear and obvious explanation. Instead, we have a set of common factors that most likely go into being a furry and some good motivations. So, the furry community has a high rate of neurodivergence in being shy, reserved, anxious, and highly creative. Which, hey nerds, if this sounds familiar, you bet your ass you're right. If you hadn't watched Lord of the Rings as a child too many times, you'd be a fucking furry right now. With most people entering the fandom because they're exposed to furry artwork, furry porn, or the online side of the culture, and then feeling a kinship with furries is usually how you become one. You're basically a proto-nerd looking for a sense of community and something to attach your hyperfixations to, and a safe place to express your creativity without putting yourself at risk emotionally and socially. And so you joined the furries because the first one you met was nice to you. Or your dad. So, while you're dealing with the existential dread that you could become a furry because, like being gay for some reason, you think being a furry is a bad thing, let's talk about the terminology. The first and probably the most important is a fursona, which is your representation of a furry form. And this can be any species, real or imagined, or even a hybrid or what is called a tar, which is a character with both 4 legs and arms. And species, hybrids, and tar are all terms that you'll probably see at some point if you're around furries enough. And if you decide to dress up as this character, the costume is called a fursuit. Now, technically anything is a fursuit, but what most people mean is one of those suits you've absolutely seen before that are full body fur with a massive head on top. Nice. Also hot as fuck, as you can imagine. I mean, you're basically wearing a very, very hairy, thick suit with a plastic shell covered in fur over the top of your head. Shit gets real sweaty real fast. And there's a subtype of fursuit, often called a mersuit, which is a fursuit designed for sex in mind. Which brings us to the idea of yiff or yiffing. Put simply, yiffing is the term for furry sex, but has some gay implications. Honestly, probably because of the amount of gay people in the community. So, a mersuit is a fursuit designed for yiffing. Which, if that sounds sexy to you, 1, I don't think I'm nearly as much of a freak as you are, and 2, you might need to admit that you're a furry, bud. But if you like that style, I mean, furry style, not yiffing style, then you might like a type of art called kemono, which is both a Japanese furry and is also the name given to the entire art style. If you've ever seen something and been like, that kind of looks like a furry, but I can't tell why, you're probably looking at the kemono art style. And that is a Kemono. I think technically it's pronounced kimono, but I don't want to confuse people. I'm pretty sure it's kimono, but I'm gonna say kemono just for this episode. But now we're gonna get into the more social side of furry terms. So, firstly, someone new to the community would be called a baby fur, a neo fur, or a newbie. While someone who has been in the community for a long time is called a gray muzzle. Which I'm actually kind of pissed about, because how fucking dare the furries take the coolest goddamn name for a respected elder of an anthroculture. Now I can't use that without everyone immediately assuming I'm a fucking furry. Anyways, when you get a group of furries together that you run with and are friends with, that's called your pack. Now, we should also talk about some of the lumped in fandoms brought up earlier. So, the first term is a pseudo fur. This is kind of like the queers we were talking about earlier. These are people that don't dislike or discount themselves from being a furry, but don't really consider themselves one. So, like, sure, they'll join your group chat and maybe go to cons and be friends with you, but they're probably not going to have a persona or really much interest in doing all the things the furries do, except for maybe the gay sex if you're that kind of furry. Also lumped in with furries would be the Therians, people that have a spiritual belief that their souls aren't entirely or at all human. And for these people, having a persona is less like, well, I think that's neat, or I really have a fetish for cartoony, unblinking eyes staring at me in the face while I get stuffed like a hostess pastry, and more as a representation of their soul or spirit or their true self. And here's the thing, I'm not going to judge. I'm a pagan. I believe weirder shit. I believe weirder shit than sometimes the soul of a human and animal merge into one. Similar, but not the same, would be otherkin, that feel like a different species but in a human body. For them, being a furry is a way to express their truth and experiences. Also, lumped in would be bronies, adults that like My Little Pony. Usually because the furries are the only ones that generally accept them. And the subcategory of furry called planty, which is a furry but with plants and fungi, which is super rare but not unheard of. Also, on a little bit of a tangent, I tried looking to see how big that community was. There's like a few pieces of art that I've seen of people's like plant sona, and one Reddit post talking about like a supposedly infamous one of someone's plant sona as a sunflower that is like startlingly sexy, and I can't find that. I have no idea what the fuck they're talking about. So if you know what they're talking about, please let me know. Um, but anyways, there's also a group that tends to intertwine across the sexuality of furries, pet players. Now this one's kind of iffy, but basically they're kind of like the bridge between furries and the BDSM community, but aren't really part of either. They're their own community, but there's some occasional overlap that I feel like should be brought up here as well. And really, all that a pet player is it's someone that has a kind of like BDSM fetish or lifestyle where one person plays the role of the owner, the other person plays the role of like an anthropomorphized pet. Um, but with all of these people who are welcome, you know who isn't? Steves, or Larrys, or Smoothies, or Fleshies. All of which are terms to describe outsiders of the fandom. Now, not every outsider is a Stephen Larry of the smoothest flesh, instead just the assholes. This term is a derogatory term used to describe bigots that attack the furry community. So, like, you, if you're just curious and are listening to this as a primer, aren't one. But with that, let's take a quick detour and talk about some history. Alright, so the history of furries is actually one that we need to go back surprisingly long for. Because since the beginning, humans have been fascinated by the idea of anthro characters, with the oldest being the Lowenmensch figures from about 35,000 years ago, depicting humans with lion heads. And from the ancient times all the way through the Middle Ages and beyond, various cultures have depicted animal people in their art, from the Guanal lioness in Iraq to the ancient Egyptian gods, from medieval werewolves to ancient depictions of demons. Basically, every piece of folklore, religion, and even a lot of analogies use anthro characters. But we don't really start getting to the earliest forms of furry culture until the 19th century. During the 1800s, due to the ability to now create mass consumable media, some of the most pulpy fictions become popular, including sci-fi, fantasy, detective and crime fiction, and children's stories, which all, in some part, contain anthro characters, like the Beatrix Potter books in the 1890s, Alice in Wonderland in 1865, The Jungle Book in 1894, The Dr. Moreau in 1896, and the comic strip Mr. Jack in 1896 as well. And also the works of Felix Stalton, who is a very influential and celebrated writer from around 1926 to his death in 1945. But don't worry, he was one of the good Germans that fled. But he had a habit of having a lot of main characters, particularly POV characters, be animals or transformed into animals. Most popularly would be Bambi or the Hound of Florence, both of which would later become cornerstones of furry film. In 1945 as well, Animal Farm does something similar, although with a strictly political message. And after World War II, due to the popularization of animation and comic books, anthro characters become incredibly popular and linked with children's entertainment. Until the 60s and 70s, when the experimental attitude towards art leads to more experimental animation, including anthro animation. And pretty quickly, they started to cover more adult and controversial topics to appeal to an audience that grew up on cartoons and was used to the medium but were more grown up and had fallen out of it. Stuff like Watership Down, Fritz the Cat, Planet of the Apes, and even Kimba the White Lion. Also, I mentioned Planet of the Apes. I'm talking about like the comic version of Planet of the Apes, not the live action. And in 1976, after the creator of Fritz the Cat had become tired of his creation and the absolute fucking money sink it had become to produce less than stellar results, he literally killed Fritz. Like, Fritz died in one of his comics. And then he ended the series. And so Ken Fletcher and Reed Waller worked together to hope to fill the void of what was left, creating the Amateur Press Association and using that to release Voodoo. Now, what are those, you might ask? Well, the APA was a group of artists that worked together to create comics and other art without being under the thumb or control of any kind of a publisher, and then would collectively self-publish. While Voodoo was a series created by cartoonists to produce adult-oriented, funny animal comics using anthro characters. A year later, the Cartoon Fantasy Organization was established in LA by Mark Merlino and Fred Patton, while Steve Galachi, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that right, the same year began work on what would become the anthro war comic, Albedo. And his work being revealed at Northeast Con, World Science Fiction Con in Boston, would create a huge fan group for his work, which would contribute to furries exploding to life in the 80s. With the death of Voodoo in the early 80s due to a lack of contributions, a new APA was founded, Roarbrazzle, which is when the fandom begins to become more and more of a furry fandom. At the same time, the independent comics movement took hold with the advent of direct market comic retail, allowing independent comics to self-publish a lot easier and cheaper. At the same time, the literary world once again embraced anthro and animal main characters. Then in 1985, as part of the San Diego Comic-Con, the first furry party ever was hosted, with it becoming tradition to have it be part of the con, and causing an explosion of membership. And over the next decade, with the framework of the internet and mass communities being born, furries spread across the world. However, not all was good in paradise, because almost since the inception, furries have been doing the thing that a bunch of gay, socially awkward, probably autistic nerds did when they're amongst their people. Fuck like rabbits. A lot. And loudly. And obviously. So by 1998, it became such a massive issue that the San Diego Con would almost annually result in a massive scandal, and being tired of it, a group of furries spoke out. And were immediately shut down, bullied, and mocked for their puritanical beliefs. In response to feeling like they were furries being burned at the stake for raising concerns that they were over-sexualizing their fandom, they formed a group called the Burned Furs. And they preached that the furry community needs to back off the sexual aspects, be more respectful in public, and focus on the fandom being about being fans of anthro characters, not about fucking each other's brains out, and that sex and sexuality has no place in the furry community. However, their fervency and fanaticism create another group, the Freezing Furs. being a group that believed that going puritanical in the other direction was a terrible idea. So they advocated for healing and improving the image of furries over time without policing what people did in their bedrooms, and that additionally, the burn furs were actually a hate group. And some of that is because a good amount of the burn furs had homophobic ideas. And this division was only intensified when the leader of the furry community at the time, that was put in place after the last one stepped down, was a burn fur. Which, combined with the infighting, would cause a total collapse of the convention and single organized furry organization. In a way, solving the controversy. But, in the same way that shooting someone in the face stops them from making small talk with you. And from there, while having the same origins and bones, the furries began to fracture into their own sub-communities. So let's talk about them in the current section. Okay, so with that covered, which sounds like a fucking Warhammer faction introduction, let's talk about who a furry is. Well, as of 2011, there are somewhere between 1.4 and 2.8 million furries worldwide, an average of 2.1 million. And there hasn't been anything about the community shrinking, so if things went up in proportion to the growth of human population, there's an average of 2.4 million furries worldwide. Which is not a massive number, but is pretty respectable. Note, these are people asked if they were furries, not people who would actually technically classify. So it might be higher, might be lower. But, okay, how old are they? Well, the average age is 28.3 years old, but the majority, about 20%, are between 18 and 20, with the combined 21 to 32 age bracket being 39%, and older than that being about 24% total, give or take. So, in general, while the average age is like 28.3, like very clearly an adult, the majority, the most number of furries are actually pretty young. But where do they come from? Well, when asked, about 34.9% of furries said America and 16.5% said from Canada, with 11.1% being Chinese, 9.1% being British, 8.2% German, and 4.5% being Finnish. Which is really it for the high numbers, although mind that this was gathered in North America, so there's going to be some bias in the sample size. However, it should go to show that the majority of furries, even accounting for that bias, came from North America. And ethnically, it kind of lines up too, with 78.6% of furries being white and 15.3% being East Asian, which again does support that number. But also most furries, about 73.2%, are male, with more trans and NB members than female members, being 12.5% each compared to 10.1%. Also, there's very high percentages of genderqueer, gender fluid, and agendered people, being 4.2, 5.6, and 2.9% respectively. Which, considering what we discussed earlier with furs being very welcoming to queer people, makes a lot of sense. Sexually, 28.8% are gay, with 23.4% being bisexual, and 16.5% identifying as pansexual. Interestingly, a significant portion, 10.5%, of furries are ace, which is 0.4% more than straight. Again, the furries are very welcoming to queers. Unsurprisingly, furries also tend to be very central or left, with 19% having leftist political views and 33% having leftist socialist views. While economically, 19% are centralist. Unsurprisingly, the right wing didn't even crack 10% once, getting closest with economics. Meaning your average furry is an 18 to 20-year-old white American gay boy with leftist political and social beliefs, but more conservative financial beliefs. Which, put your fucking cock away. Be respectful, for fuck's sake. Twinks are not there for you to jerk your wiener to. They're people too. Also, would, respectfully. Maybe. I don't know. But I'm like the opposite of a Minecraft YouTuber. I would prefer my sexual partners could legally have a beer and don't remember K-12 very vividly. But let's address some stereotypes. Firstly, that a lot of people assume that there's something wrong with furries for them to be into this shit. And one, rude, but also, as we've discussed, it's just a different kind of nerd. But there are high levels of disability, with half of all furries having a disability of some kind, with the majority being cognitive or mental health related, with 32 and 35% respectively, and the rest below 10% each. However, when asked about life satisfaction on a scale from 1 to 7, furries average at 5.25 on their self-esteem, and on their self-esteem, they rate at 4.6. Now, for context, weebs report 4.65 life satisfaction and 4.25 self-esteem. And the biggest reason isn't even their persona, as some might assume, with only people with acquired disabilities saying that it helped them to, manage it much, with an average of 4.5 out of 7. So it's not about that. Honestly, it's probably because being a furry is a more tight-knit community and a lot more social. And that, while it's annoying and grody sometimes, sexual expression and being open about your orientation and gender is probably part of it too. Also, as a side note, furries are not in fact rich, with the highest number of them making 20 to 29.k a year, about 20%. And 73% of them make under the US's average income of 40k a year. So, yeah, furries aren't rich, and their occupations are as varied as any other nerd group. Now, while we could just spend all of our time dispelling these false beliefs, there are some things that are actual issues in the community I would be remiss to not bring up. First are issues around sex and sexuality. A lot of furries see the community as being far too open with sex and sexuality, and far too tolerant of fetishes and problematic sexual habits, which creates a negative public image. Stuff like zoophiles, pedophiles, and sexual predators, and just general sex pests being part of the community, and not really a whole lot of self-policing done about it. Which is really fucking bad, and disgusting. And why is this allowed? Well, because furries have a habit of being almost too permissive. Added to the fact that most furries are very young, and it probably hasn't fully hit them yet, that a 30-year-old man interested in them at 17 is extremely problematic and gross. Or how zoophiles get their way in because of the line between animal and feral persona being kinda hard to parse at times. And leading into the second major issue, furries tend to have a lot of problematic people in their ranks, because they're already a nerdy fringe group filled with shy nerds that have a hard time excluding people, leading to full-on Nazis being in furry spaces and not instantly kicked out, or subgroups of furries that are white supremacists. Also, by the way, if you're a Nazi furry and are somehow still listening, just know you'd probably get tossed in the gas chamber for being fucking insane if it was 1940. But not helping is that furry subcultures have a lot of infighting, intergroup stereotyping and bigotry, and general intolerance for each other, which can probably be drawn all the way back to when they fractured in the first place. But despite the inclusive label I talked about earlier, they're also weirdly restrictive and discouraging in some ways. Like matters of faith and religion, acceptingness of sexualities and disabilities that aren't common in the community, and a massive amount of bullying that occurs in the fandom. Often in the open and acceptingly so, with some people seeing it as their right, or just a part of the community. Also, socially, most furries are either kinda awkward or just straight up childish, making it hard to grow the community and breeding more drama. I'm gonna regret saying breeding. Especially when it comes to terminology, with everyone feeling very entitled that their terms are correct. And I'm sure I'm gonna get some of that too, but I'm trying my fucking best. But when you ask furries, in order, the most important issues are as follows. First and foremost, fursuits are too hard to come by, and fursuiters have a sense of superiority over us. Second, our fandom should be open to everyone. Third, we need to stop worrying about what everyone else thinks. Fourth, you unfortunately just kind of have to deal with the drama, it comes with the territory. And fucking fifth in line is that maybe we should be worried about our public image. Fifth, when the furry community is the butt of just about every cringe joke since the goddamn year 2000. Then it's that furry porn is a massive part of the community. Furries ruining everything they touch, which, holy shit, I'm both surprised and not surprised. Furries also believe that, because the number one fear of about half of all nerd conventions is the furries are coming. Second to last is that the furry community isn't open enough about sex. Not open enough. Excuse me? But last, dead fucking last, and I can't believe it, is that some people shouldn't allowed in. This is bonkers to me. But, okay. Entirely understandable. So let me tell you why at the soapbox. Furries are cringe. There, I said it. But you know what? So are all of us nerds. Yeah, you heard me. You in the back, painting the backpack straps in your Deathcore Krieg model. And yeah, you up front with your Terry Pratchett books tucked under your arm. And the whole fucking lot of you over there with your fucking manga and waifu figurines. And you there, cringe posting on TikTok about horny bards and natural ones. All of you are cringe. And you know what? That's fine. And I fucking love you. Because we're all together in our cringe. Our specific fandom and hyperfixations are fucking cool to us, goddammit. And nerddom is accepting that. But you know what we've all had that they haven't yet? The big bad controversy that makes us get our shit together. Wargamers and TCG players with your BO-riddled neckbeards shouting heresy at the back of the LGS until people got tired of you. Literary nerds with just so much racism and homophobia. RPG players with the satanic panic, over-sexualization, and DMs crossing boundaries and borders like they were goddamn Mother Russia. Gamers and Gamergate, or all those slur interventions and special language blockers the game developers had to make for you. Weebs and your everything. We've all had massive controversies, and what have we done in the aftermath? Exiled our most problematic community members, expressed a dedication to never let that happen again, and improved our communities and made them bastions for people to escape the world and let people come out and say that they fucking love our fandom. You know who hasn't? Furries. Furries, you haven't had a world-shaking controversy that makes you realize that you can't just awkwardly ignore clear and obvious shitlord problematic or criminal behavior. That you have to shut that shit down. You're still in the nerd infancy of being pre-controversy. So you don't see them as issues because you're more attached to the community and keeping it than you are to your morality. And that's not judgment. Like I just said, all of us have had that. But I also know that you're not going to do anything until you have to. Again, we're nerds too. We understand. But I think I understand more. Because mask off, I'd have to admit something. Or maybe mask on. Because I'm kind of a furry. Look, okay, a lot of my sexual awakenings were because of furry flash games and hentai when I was way too young to be playing them. And I'm around a lot of furries. I love fantasy stuff, and I'm a massive fucking nerd. The only reason I'm not a furry is because I'm as shy online as I was in person, and I started playing D&D instead of reading Sonic AO3. I am at least a pseudo-fur. So I understand the reflex. Because it's hard to admit being a furry to people who aren't. So it's hard to separate yourself from the community and put your money where your mouth is, or risk getting separated, or risking kicked out because you're afraid that if you question the Nazi furry in your local community, that you'll lose everything and everyone. I understand. It took a long time to really realize that I'm kind of a furry. It was literally harder than coming out as polysexual. But hey, at the very least, even if it's not too much help, I'm here for you Exodus furries. You'll have a place in my community where the Nazis can't roam. And hey, maybe you'll help the other nerds discover, like I have, that we're not too different, you and I. I mean, mostly. You are about 5 to 8 inches taller, covered in fur, and have very large, concerningly happy eyes. But hey, come on in. hey, wow, look at that, another one with a hopeful ending. Anyways, if you have opinions, advice on how to make the show better, what your persona is, where I can find a furry femboy twink, and really anything else you want to tell me, make sure to email me at waytatpods@gmail.com. That's WAYTATPODS@gmail.com. And remember, check out my other podcast, Waytat, where I do basically the same thing, but with normal things. Sometimes. And also remember to follow me on Twitter at waytat_pods for more episode announcements. Alright, have a good night. Don't murder. Have fun. And remember, tip your character sheet artist. They worked very hard on those areola details. This has been Why Are You Talking About This Nerd? I've been your host, William. Good night.